In the previous session, we tried to understand the role of an ABAP consultant, wherein we tried to understand the different types of programs we develop as an ABAP consultant. And I've also said that most of the developments we do are SAP GUI based applications. So in this session, I'll try to give you an overview of the architecture of an SAP system, because it's important for you to understand what exactly happens when you execute your ABAP programs. So what's going behind the scenes. At the end of this session, you should be really comfortable identifying the different layers of an SAP system and the purpose of each layer in your program execution. SAP system, the ECC system we are discussing about, consists of a three-tier architecture. So it has three layers basically. So we have this two-tier architecture, multi-tier architectures. So SAP uses three-tier architecture. So it was previously called R3 system, representing a real-time three-tier architecture system. But now we no more call it an R3 system. We call it ECC system. So an ECC system consists of it is basically a three-tier system consisting of a presentation layer, application layer, and a database layer. We'll try to understand these three layers in detail. What makes up these three layers? So what is there in the presentation layer? What is there in the application layer, and what is there in the database layer, or what is their purpose basically. The advantage of using a three-tier architecture is that you are separating your presentation and the database, and in between you are adding a third layer. For example, in a typical two-tier architecture, you have the presentation layer and the database. The end users will be using the presentation layer, and the database is tasked to store the data as well as process the programs. So whenever you are running a program in the database layer itself will take care of processing the program. So basically you're keeping all your business logic in the database itself. Whereas in a three-tier architecture, we have a separate database whose job is just to maintain the data, and then we add this application layer in between where we actually maintain the business logic, and then we have the presentation layers. In SAP, the presentation layer is any system where you install this SAP GUI. So SAP has its own proprietary GUI that you need to install to access an SAP system. So in any system you install this SAP GUI becomes your presentation layer. Okay, so it's the user's workstation. So for every user who wants to access your SAP system, you install this SAP GUI in their system. Okay, and that becomes the SAP the presentation layer. You can think of this SAP GUI as a web browser. For example, if you want to open a website, the website is actually handled by the web server. But to open a website, you need a client. So the client is your browser. So when you input a URL in your web browser, it will make a request to the web server, which will send a response, and that response is presented to you in a user-friendly way on your web browser. So similarly, to interact with our SAP system, we basically need this SAP GUI. You can think of the functionality of this SAP GUI is similar to a web browser. The only difference is that the protocol the SAP GUI uses is different from the protocol that web browser uses. So the presentation interface SAP GUI enables users to interact with the SAP system and enter or display data. For example, the other program which I've shown you previously, this is the SAP GUI that I've installed in my PC, and I'm opening this transaction or this application within that SAP GUI. When I give you an introduction to ABAP, at that time I'll be explaining all the different screen elements that you see on the SAP GUI and how to open different applications and transactions. For example, the other program which I opened in the previous session, here I'm running this program in my presentation layer. I'm running it in my SAP GUI, and here I'm entering the data, right? Whatever inputs I make, I'm making this in the presentation layer in my laptop. And once I make this and click on execute, this SAP GUI actually sends this request to the application server, which will process the request and it will send back some result. So once I'm clicking on execute, it is actually making the request to the application server. The application, the code, the ABAP code that I've written in this program is being processed by the application server. Once the processing is complete, it will send back a result which is displayed in my GUI again. So the SAP GUI takes the user inputs, sends the request to the application server, and whatever response the application server is giving, it will present that to me on my screen. So that's the basic task of an SAP GUI. SAP GUI accepts inputs from the user and sends the request to the application server for processing. The application server sends the result back to the SAP GUI, which formats the display. So for example, if you're running a report, on the initial screen, you input some selection criteria. For example, you want to see the orders in the last 30 days. Then you make that input on the screen and then click on execute. Then the request is sent to the application server, which will process the data and send back that result. And that result could be in a table format, which your SAP GUI will present it to you on the screen. Right? So the role of the SAP GUI is similar to a web browser. It is not exactly processing anything. When you're running this program, the program is not running locally in your laptop. The SAP GUI is not processing that program. It is simply taking your inputs, sending that as a request to the application server. The application server will process that and send back some response, which the SAP GUI will display it to you on your screen. So that's the basic task of the SAP GUI. So that's why to install this SAP GUI, you don't need a very high-end system, because nothing is getting processed locally in your system. It is simply taking your inputs and sending it to the application server. So any basic system you can use to install the SAP GUI, and that becomes the presentation layer in your SAP system architecture. So since we have different environments, SAP GUI is available for different environments, such as SAP GUI for Windows environment. So if you're using a Windows PC, then you can install the SAP GUI for Windows to make it to use it as your presentation layer. Then we also have this SAP GUI for Java environment. If you're using Mac, for example, or any Linux-based systems, then you can install SAP GUI for Java environment in those systems. Then that becomes your presentation layer. And we also have this SAP GUI for HTML. It is not used much, but if you want to use a web browser itself as your presentation layer, then you can use this SAP GUI for HTML. But this was SAP's way of web enabling SAP applications, but it really doesn't work that well. So generally, you don't find users using SAP GUI for HTML. But most of the users use Windows PC, so most of the times we use SAP GUI for Windows. Especially for development, there are certain features which are available only in SAP GUI for Windows, and you won't have those features in SAP GUI for Java or Web GUI. As a developer, it is recommended that you use a Windows PC for the development and you install this SAP GUI for Windows, because all the development tools that we use in ABAP, some of the features will be missing if you are using a Mac, for example, and install SAP GUI for Java environment, especially the screen designing and stuff like that. That is your presentation layer. Basically, it's simple program, a 1 GB file that you download and install in your system, and that becomes your presentation layer. So that's your SAP GUI. Then application layer is the most important thing, because all the ABAP programs that you write, when you execute those programs, these programs are executed in the application server, not in the presentation server, right? So they are not getting executed locally in your system. So it's important that you understand what are the different components you find in an application server and how exactly your ABAP program is being handled by the application server. So in ABAP, we don't have thing like a compiler. For example, in C, C++, once you write the code, you compile your code. In ABAP, we don't have such thing, but we have something called a runtime environment. So whatever code you write, there should be something which interprets that code to perform those tasks that you're asking it to perform. Those are handled by the runtime environment. So basically, your application server provides the runtime environment for your ABAP programs. So without ABAP application server, your ABAP programs cannot run. What is this application layer made up of? Application layer is where an ABAP program carries out its work. The application layer of an RT system is made up of application servers and a message server. For example, the application layer consists of one message server, and you can have multiple application servers in that configuration. So basically, each application server will have some physical limit. For example, let's say you have configured your application server with let's say 32 GB RAM, and there is some processor configuration, hard drive configuration. Based on your hardware configuration, it can take only a certain amount of load, right? Like for example, it can handle 100 connections, or 200 users can run different programs at the same time. But as your load increases, as you have more number of users running more resource intensive applications, then your application server may become slowed down, because it can only take so much of load. One way is you can upgrade the system to have more memory or install more hardware, or else you can distribute the load by having multiple application servers in your application layer. How it works is, for example, let's say you have application server, and if this is the only application server in your landscape, then you have something called a message server, and this is your presentation layer. Let's say there is a user who has installed SAP GUI, and whenever you are trying to log into the system, then it will go to the message server, and message server will connect you to the application server. So in the application layer, for example, this is your application layer. This is your application layer. So application layer consists of one message server, and you can have one or more application servers. What is the role of this message server? The message server performs two tasks. One is it will take care of load balancing, and second, it will help these application servers to communicate with each other. For example, let's consider a scenario where you have two application servers in the landscape. So you have application server 1 and application server 2. Now when the user tries to log into the SAP system, the request will go to the message server, and message server will see which application server is free to take that load. For example, one application server is already running at 70% capacity, while the other application server is only running at 5% capacity. Then the message server will connect you to the server which is less on load. Okay, so once you are connected to an application server, whatever request you are making will directly go to that application server. You will not use message server as a mediator anymore. Message server comes into picture only when you're first logging into the system. When you first log in, it will see which application server is free to take the load, and it will connect you to that application server. And after that, any request you are making will directly go to that application server. Okay, so this is the purpose of the message server. Basically, it is taking care of load balancing. And the second important purpose is, sometimes let's say one user is connected to application server 1, and there is one more user, user 2, user 1. So this user is connected to application server 2. So this guy is connected to application server 2, and this guy is connected to application server 1. Now let's say this guy has opened one document for editing in application server 1. While this guy is user 1 is editing this application this document in application server 1, if the user 2 tries to edit the same document, then there should be a way for this application server 2 to know that this document is already open somewhere else in other application server, right? Because this, if there is no way, then these two users can open the same document for editing in two different application servers, because they are connected to two different application servers. What happens is that this message server helps these application servers to communicate with each other. So whenever you try to open a document, this application server 1, for example, can check with all the other application servers in the landscape to see if the same document is open for editing by anybody else. If none of the other users have opened it for editing, then it can allow the user to edit it. Otherwise, it can throw an error saying that somebody else has already opened that document for editing. So that way, if you have more than one application server in your landscape, then this message server plays two important roles. One is to take care of load balancing, and the second is to help these application servers communicate with each other. Even if you have a single application server, we still install this message server in the landscape. Because tomorrow, if you want to add additional application servers, then you can simply connect them to the message server. This message server can be installed in the same application server, or it can be installed separately as a separate system also. So there are different configurations. We don't need to know too much about them, because this is the job of a basis consultant, how he should design the application layer. For us ABAPers, we really don't need to bother about all these things. But it's important to understand that the application layer consists of message server, and it can have multiple application servers, and the role of a message server is to help with load balancing as well as help the application servers to communicate with each other. So the application layer of an R3 system, we no more call it an R3 system, we call it ECC system, is made up of the application servers and the message server. Message server is responsible for communication between application servers, and as I said, the purpose of this application server is to interpret your ABAP programs. So it provides something called a runtime environment, which whenever you execute a program, it will read the code and try to perform those tasks. For example, if you write a statement to select some data from the database, then the application server will actually connect with the database to get you that data into your program. So all these things are taken care by the application server. And programs run only in the application server. So it's very important to understand, whenever you're executing an ABAP program in your PC, it is not actually executing locally in your PC. It is actually running in the application server. Your SAP GUI is simply sending the request to the application server, and whatever response it is getting, it is presenting it to you. Similar to how you, for example, if you open Gmail and try to open an email, nothing is actually getting executed locally in your browser except for some JavaScript code. But all the data, everything is stored in the Google servers. So the web server is actually fetching the data for you and sending back that data as a response to your request, which your browser is presenting it to you. So similarly, in SAP GUI also, nothing really gets executed locally. All your ABAP programs run in the application server only. And as we said, application layer consists of message server and multiple application servers. If you dig deep into the application server, what is this application server consists of? What are the different components of an application server? Application server consists of a dispatcher and multiple work process. The role of a dispatcher is to assign the request to a work process, and the work process executes the request and becomes free to take up another request. For example, if you try to understand this application server, I'm just trying to keep it very simple by only showing you what you need to know. There are a lot of other components which we need not worry about. But in simple terms, you can think of application server as something like this. Let's say this is your application server. And within this application server, there's something called a dispatcher. And to this dispatcher, we have different work process connected. So you have, this is a configurable option. When the basis guy is installing your SAP system, he'll decide how many work process we need. So let's say this is work process 1, work process 2, work process 3, and work process 4. So you can have any number of work process. Whenever you are making a request, let's say a user is running a report, and we have, let's say, 2 users. Now this user 1 is running one report, so he's basically making a request. The request will be sent to the dispatcher. The dispatcher will see which work process is free to take the request, and it will assign the task to that work process. Let's say when he's running this report, the request is assigned to work process 1. Now this work process will process that request and it will send back the result and it becomes free to take a new request. These work processes are not tied up to a user, right? This work process can take a request from any user. So we are not really tying up a work process to the user. You're not, when you log into the SAP system, you're not allotted any work process. You simply connect to an application server, and whenever you're making a request, the request will be sent to the dispatcher. The dispatcher will see which work process is free to take that request, and it will assign that task to that work process, which will process the request and send back the result. Similarly, let's say this user is running a report which is taking, let's say, 10 minutes to run. So the work process is currently processing his request. While work process 1 is processing this request, if user 2 makes a new request, for example, he's also running another report, then the request will again go to the dispatcher. Since dispatcher sees that work process 1 is already busy processing some request, so it will assign it to work process 2 because this is free. Now, if at this point user 1 report is handled by work process 1, user 2 report is handled by work process 2. If user 1 or user 2 makes another request, let's say user 1 again runs one more program in a new window, then again the request will go to the dispatcher. Now it sees that 1 and 2 are busy, so it will assign that to work process 3, right? So like that, whenever you're making a request, it is assigned to work process 3. Now, after 10 minutes, let's say user 2 is making a request, and by that time work process 1 has already finished the first request and it is now free to take a new request. Now when user 2 makes a request, the dispatcher will see that work process is free. Work process 1 is free now because it has finished processing the previous user's request. So it can assign this task to work process 1. Okay. So like that, whenever you're running any reports, your request is going to the dispatcher in the application server, and the dispatcher will see which work process is free to take the request and it will assign that task to the work process. So work processes are not really tied up to a user. They simply take the request, process it, and send back the result. So the work process executes the request and becomes free and ready to take another request. And we have different types of work process. We have dialog work process based on the type of request you're making. For example, if you're running a report via SAP GUI screen, then that is handled by something called a dialog work process. Okay, in SAP, dialog means screen. And if you are doing some database updates in the program, then those are handled by update work process. Similarly, if you are running a background job, so you want to run a report every weekend at a particular time, then you don't need to be physically present to execute it. You can schedule it to run in the background. So any background type background requests are handled by the background work process. And similarly, if you're giving a print spool request, then those are handled by spool work process. For example, if you go to this transaction SM50, here you can see different types of work process. And you also notice that we have this DIA work process, update work process, BTC background work process, spool, and update 2. For update, we have two types of work process. One handles the high priority updates, one handles the low priority updates. Like that, you can have any number of work process. This is a configurable option which the basis guy can configure. So you can say that, okay, in the system, let me have 15 dialog work process, 2 background work process, and 2 update work process. So like that, he can decide based on the load the system will take and the types of programs the users will run. Okay, so just to explain that concept of the request being assigned to a work process and then the work process sending back the result. Whenever I'm running, for example, they process the request so fast that if I just run the program and come back to the screen, it won't show me that the request is being handled. So I'll keep this in debug mode so that we can see that this request is being assigned to a particular work process. So I'm running this program and I'm in debug mode. So I'm actually asking the work process to wait so that I can debug. If I come back and refresh this page, the screen, you can see that my request was assigned to a dialog work process and since I'm debugging, it is kept on hold, and this is the program I'm running. Okay, and once I'm done with this, once I come out of the debugger, the program execution is complete. The work process has finished executing. It has sent back the result, which is displayed on my SAP GUI screen. Right at this point, if I go back and refresh, you'll see that that work process is changed to waiting status. Right? If it is in running status, that means it's processing some request. If it is waiting status, that means it is ready to take a new request. Right? Now, when I execute again, it will again assign it to a work process, which will process, send back the result, and becomes waiting status, so that it can take a new request either from me or any other user who's logged into this SAP system. We have different types of work process to handle different types of requests. Again, what type of work process we need, how many of them we need, is decided by the basis consultants. So they'll monitor the system on certain parameters, and accordingly they'll take a call on that. In short, whenever you're making a request, the request is going to the application server. In the application server, we have something called a dispatcher. So the dispatcher will see which work process is free, and it will assign your request to that work process. So basically, work process is the one which is actually processing your request. So work process has something called ABAP interpreter, which will actually interpret your code. So all the statements that you're writing in ABAP program, the ABAP interpreter will actually interpret that code and perform those actions. So if you are asking it to calculate some values, then the ABAP interpreter is the one which is actually doing that job for you. Right? So a work process has three things inside it. One is called the screen processor, ABAP interpreter, and database interface. The role of screen processor is to take care of transferring data from screen to program. And the role of ABAP interpreter is to actually interpret your ABAP statements and perform actions accordingly. And the role of database interface is whenever this ABAP interpreter comes across a statement that requires interaction with the database. For example, you've written a select query, then you need interaction with the database to get the data for you. So whenever the ABAP interpreter comes across any statement that requires interaction with the database, then it will assign the task to the database interface within the work process, and the database interface will actually take care of interacting with the database. So I think I have that here. So if you see here in this image, so we have this SAP GUI where the user is connected. So he is connected to the dispatcher. Whenever he is making a request, the request goes to the dispatcher, and it will assign it to a free work process. And within the work process, we have something called screen processor, ABAP interpreter, and database interface. Whenever the ABAP interpreter, while it is processing your ABAP statements, if it comes across any statement that requires interaction with the database, it will hand over the task to database interface, which will actually hit the database and get you the data or perform whatever actions you want to perform. And then after that, the control will be given back to the ABAP interpreter. So it will continue interpreting other statements in your program. So this is how it works. And we also have something called Internet Communication Manager, ICM. When you're using SAP GUI, it actually uses a SAP proprietary protocol called DIAG, Dynamic Information and Action Gateway. So that's a proprietary SAP protocol which is used to communicate between your SAP GUI and the application server. So they transfer this data in binary format. It doesn't support encryption, but it supports compression. So basically, your SAP GUI is using this DIAG protocol to communicate with your application server. But if you want to use a web browser to access your SAP applications or to access your application server, then the application server is designed to understand DIAG protocol, whereas the web browser uses HTTP protocol. Okay, so if you directly try to use a web browser, then the application server cannot understand your request because you're sending the request in using HTTP protocol, whereas the application server uses DIAG protocol. So to overcome that problem, SAP has something called ICM. Within the application server, we have it's basically a component Internet Communication Manager. If you're using a web browser and if a request is sent to the server using HTTP protocol, then with SAP GUI, the request is directly handled by the dispatcher. However, if you're using a web browser, then the request will go to the ICM, and then the ICM will translate this HTTP protocol into DIAG protocol, which the dispatcher can understand, and it will send it to the dispatcher. Then the dispatcher will again see which work process is free, and it will assign the task to that work process. So basically, this ICM is a component, software component, which works as a middleware between your application server and your web browser. So that is the purpose of this ICM. So any server, if you want to use web browsers, then you have to install this ICM in the server. So all the latest SAP application servers have this ICM installed. So basically this ICM component makes your application server as a web server. It can act as a web server as well. Okay. And I said that every time you are making a request, that request is handled by a new work process. So for example, when I'm running a program for the first time, it is assigned to work process 1, and it is sending back me some result on my screen, and on that result I'm performing certain action. Then the request will again go to the dispatcher, and it can assign that to the same work process which processed my previous request, or it can assign it to a new work process, right? Now let's say the second time I'm making this request, it is assigned to a new work process. Let me just show you something. For example, on this transaction, I'll select something and I'll click on display. Now, for the first time when I executed that program, the request was sent to the work process 1, or let's say the request was handled by work process 1, and it has sent me the result, and it is free. Now, on the result I received, I perform certain action. Again, a new request will be sent to the dispatcher, and if work process 1 is free, it will assign the task to the same work process which previously handled my request. But if it is busy handling some other request, then it can assign it to some other work process as well. And on the screen, if I click on back, it will take me back to the previous screen. Now when I clicked on back, again a new request is sent to the dispatcher. Then that request can be handled by the previous work process, or it can be assigned to a new work process based on whichever work process is free. So since all my requests are not handled by the same work process, they are handled by different work processes. How do they know what program I'm running? How does this work process know who am I, what programs I'm running, whether I have the required authorizations to run that program or not, and what is the date format? For example, it is showing me the date and time in a specific format. This is based on my personal settings. I've set my personal settings in the system to use this format while displaying dates. So how does the work process know that what are my personal settings, so that when it is sending the result, it can format the data in that particular format? All this is handled by something called a user context. So if you see in this image, we have something called user context. We have this user context area. Basically, whenever you join an organization, for example, you're joining an organization and the basis consultant will create a user ID for you in the system. When he creates a user ID, he'll assign a role to your user ID based on your role in the companies. For example, as an ABAP consultant, I'll be given authorizations for developing programs. Whereas for a functional consultant, they won't give such authorizations. So, and again, end users, if you are into sales, then you will be given only authorizations to run some sales related applications. You won't be able to run HR related applications. So they'll create these authorizations and they'll assign these authorizations to your user ID. And when you log into the SAP system, the system will load your authorization data from the database into your application server and store it in the user context area. Okay. So when I'm making a request, before the work process process my request, it will first access the user context area to load or to roll in my user context. So this user context will have information such as what are my authorizations, what are my current settings, what is the program I'm running currently, all this information. So using this, the work process will be aware of who the user is. And once the work process has finished processing my request, it will roll out the user context so that it can take a new request. And when it gets a new request, based on the user who's making the request, it will roll in his user context into the work process. So like that, work process is rolling in the user context, applying it to the request, and once the request is done, once it has finished processing the request, it will roll out that user context. So that way it can identify who the user is. And this user context area is refreshed only when you log in and log out from the system. For example, let's say I have this program, and in this program, it's already open. Okay. I'll say I'm just trying to print out today's date, and it is printing that date in a certain format, right? dd.mm.yyyy. That is the format. It's using that format because I have set my personal settings. So for my default parameters, I've mentioned this is my date format. Now let me change this date format to something else, mm-dd-yyyy. I've changed my personal setting, and if I run this program, now this request will be sent to that work process, which will roll in my user context and apply that to the request. But it is still using the old format only. It is not showing me in the new format. That's because the user context was loaded when I logged into the SAP system, right? So it is still using that old data. When I change my default setting in SU3 transaction, it updated that data in the database. But since the program is running in the application server, and the application server was having the data that was previously loaded when I logged in, it was using the same data to apply it to my request. Whereas the data in the database is current with my new settings. So if you want to refresh this user context, then you have to log out from the system and log in back. When you log in back, it will again load your user context from the database. So if I log out and log in back, then it should display the date in my new format that I've selected. Okay. So that is your user context. User context holds information such as user's current settings, user's authorizations, and name of the program the user currently running. So based on this user context only, the application server will know, or the work process will know, whether you have the required authorizations to run. So if you try to run a transaction for which you do not have authorizations, then it will throw an error. It won't allow you to execute that program. So this is your application server. So you have the dispatcher, you have work process, and then we have this role area or user context area. And you also see something called application buffer. What happens is, whenever you are running your ABAP program and you want to process some data, the data is stored in the database, right? And your program is running in the application server. Every time you are processing some data that is there in the database, then the application server will connect to the database, get you that data, fetch the data from the database into your program in the application server, and then it will process it. If you are using some data that is very frequently used by many programs and it really doesn't change much that frequently, then you can also keep a copy of that data in the application server itself. That is called buffer. So we can buffer the database content in the application server so that when a program is requesting for certain data, the application server can fetch that from the buffer of the application server rather than hitting the database for the data. That will speed up the program processing, because when you're hitting the database, first thing, the data has to be fetched from the database. It has to scan the data in the table, then fetch the data, and then it has to transfer the data from the database server to your application server over the LAN connection or internet connection if they are at different locations. So The data transfer also will slow down your program performance because the program is waiting for the data and it is taking so much time to receive the data from the database. So if you have the data locally in the buffer, then it will speed up your program processing. But generally, only the data that doesn't change frequently, we keep it in buffer. Otherwise, you'll have the same issue where the data is updated in the database, but it is not updated in the buffer. So you'll have old data in the buffer and you're processing old data. So any situation where the real-time data is not that important, then you can keep a copy of the data in the buffer. So when we discuss about database, when we discuss about the ABAP dictionary later in the course, we'll be seeing how to buffer the data and how to buffer a particular table in the application server. So we'll be understanding all that at that time. So here you have this presentation layer where you have different SAP users connected using GUI. Then in the application level, we have the dispatcher to which multiple work processes are connected. And in the application level, we also have this buffer area. And then you have your database, right? So this is your three-tier architecture: the presentation layer, application layer, and the database layer. And what is database layer consisting of? Each SAP system has a central database in which the entire data set is stored. In SAP, for example, if you look at other programming languages like PHP or Java, you store your code, everything in a file, right? In the application, so in the web server, you're storing them as a file, and when you make a request, that the code inside the file gets executed. Whereas in SAP, we don't store anything in a file. Everything is stored in the database. Even the program code that you write will be stored in the database, right? So everything in SAP is stored in the database, be it the transaction data, be it the master data, be it your program source code, anything that you're saving persistently will be stored in the database. You also have option to store in the file format for any data. For example, you want to push some report output to the application server, then you can store it in the application server as a file, or you can store it as a file on user's desktop in the presentation server. So that option is there, but all the others, all the main data, all the transaction data, all the order information, all the user related data, everything is stored in SAP in database. So we have a table in the database, like we create different tables for different storing different data. So not only the application data, but also all the administration data, customizing settings. For example, when I change my setting to a different date format, even that setting is stored in the system in the database in a particular table. So everything is stored in the database. And we use a relational database. So the software component responsible for the database layer consists of RDBMS, Relational Database Management System. A relational database basically maintains relationships between different tables. So that is your database layer. So basically you have the presentation layer, the application layer, and the database layer. The presentation layer is the SAP GUI, which you install in your system. Then the application layer consists of this dispatcher and different work process. So all your ABAP programs are interpreted, or the application layer server provides the runtime environment for your ABAP program. So whenever you're running a program, it is executing in the application server. And then we have the database where we store all the data persistently. Whatever data you generate in the application server, when your program is running, for example, if you are generating the data, then the life of the data is transient, in the sense, once the program execution is complete, that data is lost. If you want to access that data later, then you have to persistently store it in the database. So in your program, whatever the data generated by the program, if you want to use that data again later, then you have to update that in the database so that you can access it later. If you don't update it in the database, then all that data will be lost the moment the program is closed, right? So no data is stored in the application level. All the data that you want to store persistently is always stored in the database layer. So these are the three layers that make up your SAP system. If you want to access the SAP system, the first thing you need to do is install the SAP GUI in your system. In the next sessions, I'll be showing you how to install the GUI and set up the system for developing your ABAP programs.